Congratulations. Thank you for being with us, Shonak. So
Thank
nice
you.
to have you at the festival. You were just telling me you've been in what, 5 countries in 11 days right now?
Yes.
Well, welcome to New York. Where have you been recently?
We went to Berlin, Copenhagen, Zurich, London, and now 4 countries. Sorry.
Very good. Well, we're glad to have you here. I know you're at the tail end of a journey that has taken you so far with this film, and now it's, at least for us, going to be released soon, or it's going to be released in the U.S. and I'm sure around the world along the way. Why don't we start? Actually, tell us a little bit about your background, where you live and work, some of the things that you're doing. I know you were telling me that you're a professor, you're an instructor.
I'm not formally a professor, but
Okay.
I do have an academic sort of side gig, I suppose. I did a PhD, and that was simultaneous to the first film that I'd made called Cities of Sleep. This is a film about sleeping in the open, and it's a film which sort of is a philosophical exploration of sleeping. While I was finishing the PhD, I started work on this film. And I've been, technically based in Delhi, but I've spent barely any time there in the last 1 year.
Because of this film, I assume.
Yeah, we were cutting this in Denmark.
Okay. So where did you grow up, and where did you study film, or how did you come to be a filmmaker?
I grew up in Delhi. I think this film's sort of connection is it's very deeply embedded in Delhi. Almost anybody who lives in Delhi will talk about how the air is a kind of, it's a very tactile, heavy, concrete kind of a, it's pervasive. There's a kind of monochromatic grayness that's constantly surrounding you, and you're plunged in this, the sky is a kind of diffused whole, and you're consciously aware of breathing in a kind of something which is a noxious substance and hostile to your sense of sustenance and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Delhi, and I think this film is a kind of product of your and for most people who live in Delhi, their sort of relationship with the air and, the things that you breathe in.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, the film is very embedded in a kind of vernacular, colloquial culture of Delhi, and a certain sort of triangulation of air, birds, and humans, all of which is very, in a way, Delhi-centric, but then, which is why I think it has a kind of universal push as well.
How were you thinking about that? I was going to make the observation about the specificity at the universality of some of the broader topics you're exploring. So maybe if you don't mind elaborating on how you thought about navigating those two realities, making it specific to a place that you know so well, but also a film that would be inviting and engaging to someone who's never been to Delhi.
So so firstly, when one starts, one is never thinking about how to make it inviting to somebody who's never been to Delhi, because in one sense, the more particular and the more specific and local you get, the more you expand, right? And within one single person, you get the whole vicissitudes or the saga of all kinds of human emotions. So we weren't ever carrying the anxiety of trying to be translatable to the outside world. That happens if and the main sort of thematic interest in the film was in human, non-human relationships. So that's one of the most foundationally universal thing. In terms of how the film began, I think essentially can I just say it's very odd that Nadeem is there. You've just seen him in the film. So Aman, the producer and a very old close friend of mine, we were sat in a car and stuck in a traffic signal in Delhi, and this is around the month of December, where every time you look up, the sky is like the sun is a kind of diffused blot, and it's one, like your life is laminated by this one pervasive kind of grayness. And I thought I saw this one the kites are like these lazy gliding dots in the sky. And I had the distinct impression that one of them was beginning to fall. And I pointed it out to Aman. And we were sort of gripped with this figure of the one bird that falls off a very polluted sky. And I think that was one of the first edges, like pushes of the film. The other is, of course, like meeting the brothers. So I think how it began was I literally went back home and typed, "Where do birds that fall off the sky go?" on Google. And of course, the work of the brothers immediately springs up. And the minute you go to that very small, damp, claustrophobic basement, and you see the heavy metal cutting machines and the industrial decay on one side, and on the other you have these magisterial birds being cared for, the sheer kind of bipolarity of that space is very cinematically riveting, And one of the first things that Aman and I had seen was this column of boxes, cartons, and one of them falls on its own, which is a scene in the film as well, right? So, and I think that's how the film began. Once you go then the sheer sort of surreal absurdity of this one family living in a cramped space with 250 raptors there's a lot of layers there. So,
and you said that's where the film began, and it's probably in some ways maybe easier to say that now. You've gone through this arc and this journey with this film, but can you take us back to your immediate responses? You see this place, you meet these brothers, you're embarking on making a film, but you couldn't have imagined where it would take you or sort of what route you would follow, I would imagine.
No, I couldn't. I had like 3 sort of vague coordinates when we began. The first thing was the preparation of the film was I was interested in a specific kind of a relationship with non-human life. And I was reading books like, there's this book called The Peregrine, which is an incredible book on this one person who's followed this one peregrine falcon for 10 years. It's a British book. Or H is for Hawk, or Grief is a Thing with Feathers, and so on. And in all these books, the bird sort of emerges as a kind of, there's a hypnotic, ravenous, obsessive relationship with the bird. And when I first met them and they started telling me about how they got interested in the black kite when they were young, that kind of, the kite emerges as a kind of wondrous, otherworldly, magical sort of being. It has a kind of aura and I was initially interested in that kind of thing. The other thing was that we were sure we were not making a wildlife or a nature doc because we didn't have any experience in it, nor was that the ambition of the film. And I didn't want to make anything that had either a kind of bleeding heart sentimentality that is very characteristic of some kind of environmental discourse today, which I don't get drawn to. Or it's a kind of bleak gloom and doom kind of a thing, right? Whereas the brothers, Nadeem and Saud, had this kind of a wry resilience. There's a kind of put your head down and get on with it. And it's unsentimental, and it's like, when you come to think of it, they literally have the front row seats to the apocalypse, right? Like, it's a tiny, cramped, stifled space, and the entirety of the city's birdfall comes to them. And so in that sense, it felt like a very interesting, new, poetic take on climate change. So it felt like a different kind of a style. And thirdly, just the mise-en-scène, the space itself is, birds are deliciously disobedient to your designs. So it gives it a kind of spark and a kind of surprise. And, Salek's glasses got taken in the second or the third day of the shoot. So
such an amazing moment. Such an amazing moment to capture.
Yeah, I mean, it's you get rewarded with accidents if you turn up.
True. I wonder, as you were developing the visual language that you would employ, you referenced it a second ago when we were walking up, but it has such a striking, fitting visual. There's such a striking visual approach, and I'm curious how you were thinking about that, especially in the earliest days of embarking on this film. What kind of parameters you set up for yourself? What kind of ideas you brought and then carried out?
I think we were certain that we did not want this to be an anxious or a restless film. Because the first thing that sort of strikes you when you speak to Nadeem and Saud is that they're sort of philosophers of the urban. And intuitively, it felt like the language had to have a kind of meditative, contemplative quality. And I was sure that it must not be a sweet film about nice people doing good things. So not just a film about a bird hospital, but something that allows it to zoom out and kind of take on a kind of contemplative air, because the brothers are dealing with kites, but they talk about all kinds of, they're talking about evolution, and they're talking about, behavioral changes in the city and so on. So the film had to make you kind of contemplate other things. It had to make you think about entanglement of human, non-human lives, of our neighborliness or our kinship with it had to, we kept saying that it would be nice if people walk out to the theaters and look up. So if it enchants the sky, and, you get a bit more conscious of things that are usually just murmurs at the fringes of our vision. So in that, we realized that my previous film was a kind of handheld, wherever character goes, you're following sort of a thing. But in this film, it had to be lyrical, and it had to be, there's a Hindi word called Therav, which means that you're not anxious, you're staying. And it had to therefore be poetic. And very early on, we decided that instead of, usually what happens is you either have the camera in your hand or on a tripod, and as the character is moving, you're following, right? And the movement of the characters then gets embodied in a kind of felt and fleshy way in the camera. In this case, we decided very early on that we'll have 2 tripods, and we'll place a slider in the middle. And so even if the character sort of exits or comes in or comes out, we'll just keep doing this all day. So even if the character exits, and so, like that changes the kind of rhythm of the take. So I think those are some of the early parameters.
So that's what you were referring to a second ago as we were walking in. You were talking kind of about like a horizontal kind of plane, a horizontal language that you were establishing in sort of the visual approach. Makes sense.
Also because the clear through line, apart from the brothers' storyline, was that every now and then you'd see rats, pigs, snails, horses, a whole panoply of animals. And the idea was that the audience has to get used to the fact that, yes, now you'll see 4 minutes of just rats, right? Or just pigs. And over time, I think hopefully people get accustomed to the fact that this is a secondary kind of a thread. And here the idea was to try and show the life writ large on the canvas of the city. So, and there had to be a kind of pleasure of the visual itself. So the act of aestheticizing is an important one there, right? So the things like a slow languid pan that reveals something, or a kind of slow tilt down, or a shift focus, were part of that grammar, and we decided that we couldn't be cutting it midway. So none of those shots have a kind of cut in the middle. So even the credit at the end, therefore, had to be a kind of a horizontal sort of a pan. So I think horizontality is a interesting kind of just a way to approach this film.
And in the word horizontal, we have the horizon, we have the line that connects the land to the sky, which is so much at the heart of what the film is also exploring, right? The connection between those on the ground and those above it.
Yeah, I think, we haven't spoken about the political end of the film, but some of the things is that we thought that in some ways the toxicity of the air and the toxicity of the ground, the grime of the ground, had to sort of be stapled together through the story of this one family and the black kite. So, the horizon where the twain meet, land and sky, sort of became a kind of abstraction for their kind of realistic utopia. And they have a kind of very specific kind of cruel optimism for that, but also for the kind of ways in which the political gets imbricated in this.
How, if at all, did making this film and engaging with both human and animal in Delhi, this town, this city where you are. I don't know if you're from there, but you live there, right? How did it change your perspective on this place that you presumably would know really well? Did it challenge, or did it challenge sort of ways you thought about this place, or?
Yeah, I think what happens is that a film anyway functions as a kind of fever dream, right? And when you're in it, you're just totally in the swirl of the things that you're doing. And once you're out of it, you feel a bit like, it feels like a kind of belated Stockholm syndrome sort of a thing. Like you've just come out of it and you can't believe what the last 2 years were. But we were the entire directorial team was constantly very aware of birds. And, you get these many animals in the film only if you recceed constantly, right? So we had a whiteboard where we would keep sort of maintaining a bank of places where somebody saw a turtle, or somebody saw a lizard, or somebody saw some animal somewhere. So the entirety of our 2 years was, did you hear that? Was that an alarm call or a contact call of that bird? And so sort of like the city gets remapped and reconfigured in your head through a kind of more than human perspective. And I think in more theoretical terms, it's like the human doesn't remain the absolute center point in terms of how you're navigating the city, because you're very conscious of swamps and wetlands or places of ruin or abandoned houses or so on, wherever either nature reclaims or wherever you see some kind of, something just runs past or something. So your relation to the city changes, but now it's again back to how it was before it. So it's not like a permanent stay.
So it makes me think about one more question, and I know we have to wrap it up very soon. So, but as you were talking both about the relationship to the place, the city, and the people or animals that live there, and as you were talking about going into the space of these brothers, I started wondering and thinking about the role of the documentarian and the role of the camera as either a disruptor, how you navigate the space of being a disruptor, or how you sort of integrate and sort of hopefully or maybe intentionally fall into the background. So how did you think about whether in the case of this space with these two brothers, how the camera would impact that work and that space? And then also, how did you think about the way that the camera or the role of the documentarian might impact the way you were navigating the animal space?
Right. I don't think there was one prescriptive kind of a formula for it, but I think in a way, a large part of the film is very interested in the relationship between the background and the foreground. Insofar as a certain dense background of non-human lives that's sort of foregrounded in the film. But also again, we haven't fully gotten into it, but the political stuff, right, which sort of forms the epistemic wallpaper of their lives in the film, but you sense it. So you sense that the city is in great turmoil. It's in it was a very turbulent time in the last 2 years in the city, and the film is not frontally political in a very obvious conventional sense. I think it's fairly political, but the brothers also are interested in a different kind of politics, right? They're interested in a kind of cosmological politics of humans and birds, right? But the city didn't allow you to hold on to those earlier certitudes of what you thought was the political, because the streets were on the boil constantly. And the form that we decided in terms of the political is that we have to have a kind of background that's constantly pregnant with something. So, which is when we realized that the form of the leak is very important. So the outside macro world kind of leaks in. So you hear the audio or the sound of a protest when a character goes to the balcony. You hear the sound of a character looking at a video of what is obviously very violent, like some act of violence. That bit where Salek is seeing a video in an auto rickshaw and a squirrel comes out of his pocket. So in all of those bits, the kind of the political trouble outside, you sense it through either the audio or it keeps sort of hemorrhaging in. The big real world outside sort of leaks in. And that's the kind of form that we finally settled in, that it has to be a kind of, you sense the stuff outside more than you sort of are told frontally what it is. So in that sense, I think the relationship between the background and foreground are constantly waxing and waning, hopefully.
And we're wrapping up, but in your edit, did you find that you were pushing and pulling the background and foreground in tension with each other, deciding to push the background forward and then pulling it back, or did you find that balance?
I think in the edit, the main structuring principle for Charlotte and Vedant, the editors, was that Charlotte felt that the main logic underwriting the edit of the film has to be that we keep vacillating between extreme compression and extreme decompression. So you have the compression of a very cramped claustrophobic space that is the basement, cut to the extreme decompression of the skies, the open vistas of the expanse of the city. In a way, so you're constantly going very tight and very non-tight. So in a way, it's like inhaling and exhaling, right? In a way, it's like breathing. So that kind of a form of extreme, like we're suddenly very close up and you see faces, to these really big shots of the skies with thousands of kites. So compression, decompression, more than foreground, background on the edit.
Shaunak, I really appreciate your sharing this movie. I would love to talk to you even more about it. We're out of time. Thank you for bringing the film to us at the festival. Thank you to our audience.